Welcome, everybody. Good to see you all. There are handouts by the coffee pot, which I see that John's got one. Glad y'all are here. This is the fifth, I suppose, and final class in this Desert Fathers and Mothers series. We have been journeying through the wilderness, and now we have arrived at the last of those that we will focus on. And the person we're going to talk about today, her name is Syncletica, though if you pronounce it differently, I'm not sure I would know which is right. So Syncletica, and we're going to talk about her in a moment, but let's start our time together with a prayer. And you'll see at the top of your handout, with very small margins in order to fit on two sides of paper, you'll see a collect, and this is the collect for the feast of Sarah, Theodora, and Syncletica. So three servants in one, but our focus today will be Syncletica. Grace, would you mind closing? Grace Cleghorn. Grace Cleghorn. Would you mind closing that door for us? Thanks. Let's pray that prayer out loud together. Fix our hearts on you, O God, in pure devotion, that aided by the example of your servants, Sarah, Theodora, and Syncletica, the vain pursuits of this world may have no hold upon us, and that by the consuming fire of your Spirit, we may be changed into the image and likeness of your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, to whom with you and the same Spirit be all honor and glory, now and forever. Amen. Before we dig into Syncletica's life in particular, let me just sort of remind you about where we've been. We've looked at Antony, the great father of monasticism, desert asceticism. We looked at Evagrius the ascetic. Evagrius was kind of the practical teacher. He had a really clear, rational, systematic approach to this desert life, that if you do these practical things, then spiritual growth happens. Then we took a week off, and we had dessert fathers and mothers, if you will. We made little desert cups, pudding, and cookies, and they were delicious. It was a pleasant surprise, I hope. Then last week we came back and looked at Palladius the Historian. Palladius is known primarily as the keeper of these records, but he wasn't an outsider, he was an insider. He lived the ascetic life in the desert, so he gives us some glimpses into the lives of the desert abbas and ammas. But today we're looking at Syncletica, and I chose Syncletica in particular because she is one of the very few ammas, the very few desert mothers, whose life and sayings are recorded and transmitted. We'll say more about the role of women in the desert in a little bit. To summarize where we've been, my hypothesis for you, if you will, is that life in the desert led to theological insights into who God is and how God interacts with the world. Some of that is academic, intellectual, traditional. It was transmitted from one to another. In the same way that worship in Arkansas looks different from worship in Massachusetts. Why? There are no rules about it. It's just because culturally there are differences between Boston, Massachusetts, and Fayetteville, Arkansas. Similarly, those who lived in the desert had proximity to teachers in the desert. So some of that is geographic or relational proximity. But I want to go a step further and suggest that there's something peculiar about this life apart, this apartness, this deep asceticism and the renunciation of the world and all its temptations and passions that changes the way we understand who God is and how we interact with God. Origen, that great mystical theologian, leader of the catechetical school in Alexandria, the north of Egypt, largely responsible for this stream of theology, this Alexandrian theological tradition. It wasn't without controversy, but a lot of these desert ammas and abbas talk about the spiritual life and salvation and the Bible and the Gospels accounts and how our hope for salvation is shaped in ways that feel really peculiar and strange, but I trust are easier to understand if you've left your family, left your job, left the city, moved out into the middle of nowhere. Imagine going to the middle of the Ozark National Forest, not telling anybody you're around, and just living on berries and nuts, and spending years and years doing nothing but eating simple food, trying to stay awake for days at a time, fasting, praying, and doing battle with demons. That's kind of the way in to this kind of insight. And my hope is that by the time we're finished, we will not all want to go out into the Ozark National Forest and live as strange monastics, though perhaps you're called to monastic life, and we can talk about that. But instead, what I hope is that you'll get a sense or a glimpse, a touch of kind of the strangeness and yet the holiness of this particular way of being and way of thinking. So that's our process. And today we're going to look at Syncletica. Let me tell you a little bit about Syncletica's life, and both her life pre-monastic and then during her monastic life, and then we'll read some texts. And today we're going to look not only at Syncletica, but also at the role of women in the desert monastic movement, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and also just enjoy what Syncletica has to share with us. So Syncletica lived almost certainly in the late 4th century, 380 or so. She is very clearly influenced by Evagrius, someone we've looked at before. She uses a lot of the same language in her prayer life and in her writings and in her what's been preserved of her. So we kind of understand that she and Evagrius were more or less contemporaries. We also know that the account of her life, which was written supposedly by Athanasius, but Athanasius was long dead by the time Syncletica came around, so we know it's not Athanasius, so we call it pseudo-Athanasius, someone who pretended to be Athanasius. But we know that this account was written in the middle of the 5th century, so we can kind of more or less pin Amma Syncletica down to about 380 to about 450, more or less, but we're not exactly sure. She was born in Alexandria, city of learning, city of wisdom, very cosmopolitan place. She was born into a wealthy Christian family of Macedonian origin. So think across the Mediterranean, north of Turkey, Greece, some kind of north of Greece and that kind of area, Macedonia. That's where her family was from. And we know that she was beautiful, a stunningly beautiful woman. As a child, she was a part of a Christian family. She knew about renouncers, but as a child, she was drawn to this life of asceticism. And she swore, even as a fairly young child, that she would become a monastic. Well, she had 2 brothers, and both of them died unexpectedly. One died in childbirth, and the other died right before he was to be married. She had a sister who was blind, and her parents said, "Nice idea, but we want someone to take care of us in our old age. You may not be a monastic. You will marry one of these many suitors. You're a beautiful woman. You will marry one of these many suitors. We'll even let you choose which suitor, unusual. We'll let you choose them so that we can have some kind of life beyond your time with us. If you were to leave us, who would take care of us, essentially?" But then her parents died unexpectedly, and so free of that burden, Syncletica knew exactly what she wanted to do. She sold all of her family's possessions, gave all the money to the poor, took her sister by the hand, and went to an extended family tomb on the outskirts of Alexandria, and she crawled in it, and that's where she spent the rest of her life, in a tomb, in a little cave, praying and fasting and dreaming and having visions. As a sign of her commitment to the ascetic life, she cut off her beautiful hair, a common expression of sort of a consecrated life, the life of a virgin. She followed, we know, the example of Thecla. You might have even heard of Thecla. Thecla was a contemporary of the Apostle Paul, a follower of Paul. She's not mentioned in the Bible, but her life and shared ministry with Paul is mentioned in some of the other early Christian writings. So Thecla. And she even named for her contemporaries that she thought of herself as a student or a disciple of Thecla. And so she started that life as a desert anchorite in the edge of Alexandria. You might remember from our first week, Antony, when he left his family, he started on the edge of the community, right on the edge of the wilderness where people wouldn't bother you so much. So imagine like moving out to kind of Goshen. Like if you move to Goshen, there's just not a lot of traffic. People probably don't notice if you walk around your yard naked in the middle of the night. Maybe they do, but probably not, right? That kind of wilderness, because that's the life that Antony led, but it wasn't wilderness enough, so he went into the desert. Well, Syncletica went kind of to the edge of the city and lived that desert monastic life. Here's another image of Thecla. You can see, I think, that she's huddled in her tomb, kind of in that cave. And what you probably can't see is that there's like an incense thurible hanging from the ceiling. and also what looks like an icon. So often icons will have those anachronistic references. So this is an icon of Thecla, essentially, an icon of Syncletica. I'm going to do that again, I'm sure. Syncletica here in her tomb as a monastic. Let me tell you a little bit about her monastic life, and then we'll look at some of her teachings. Like many of these desert amas and abbas, she did not want to be around people. She went there to get away from people, but people heard about her, particularly women heard about her. Women were largely not welcome in monastic communities because these men had gone into the desert to get away from women. Women were a temptation to see the women as they would project it. We're going to unpack some of that patriarchal portrayal of women as sort of tempters, sirens, if you will. So women had a hard time integrating into monastic communities. Not all of them, but many of them did. And so when women got news of this Syncletica, they went to her and they begged her, teach us your wisdom, teach us your ways, show us your insights. And she resisted, but finally gave in and began to share her practices, her way of being a monastic, a faithful follower of Jesus, with those who came to her. And it is those women, largely women, who came to her and learned from her. They're the ones that preserved her sayings and her teachings. They're the ones from whom we get an understanding of her life that gets written down and that gets transmitted throughout the generations. There are two major works that contain the sayings and the snapshot of the life of Syncletica. One, which is fairly familiar to us, probably the best well-known, is the Sayings of the Desert Fathers. I've pulled from that each week. It is a collection, alphabetical, of the sayings of these desert fathers and mothers. There are three women who are mentioned, and they happen to be the three women mentioned in our collect, Sarah, Theodora, and Syncletica. Syncletica is the one we're focusing on today, and Syncletica is the one who has the most to say. There are 27, let me make sure I get the right, 27 little sayings that are preserved in this work. The Apothegmata, I think is what it's called. I can't remember, my Greek is rusty. But anyway, so this document contains many of those teachings. As you might remember me saying a couple of weeks ago when we looked at Evagrius, however, this is a highly edited and revised text. So there are a lot of her sayings, indeed, that were left out originally, and in many of the manuscripts we get kind of sanitized versions of what this wild monastic amma would have said. The better, more reliable resource, though it also went through some manipulations, is a book called The Life and Regimen of Blessed Syncletica. It was a text that was supposedly written by Athanasius. We now know Pseudo-Athanasius. And it gives not only her sayings, the sayings is just those sort of teachings, if you will. It has many of the same sayings, some of which have since been re-revised back into like versions like this. There's a little asterisk that says these weren't left out originally, but we've pulled them from the other sayings book. But also gives some snapshots into her life. So it helps us know how old she was, about her family life, about her beauty, about cutting her hair, and the like. So that life and regimen. On your handout, you'll see sayings and you'll see life. The sayings are from the sayings of the Desert Fathers. The life readings are from the life and the regimen of Syncletica. You can find both of those in old translations online, and you can search for these. They're never formatted very well online. It's always like single-spaced screen from a margin to margin all the way across, and it's really difficult to read it, but they're available, and of course you can buy a bound version as well if you would like. We know from the life and regimen of Syncletica that she became ill, probably with cancer, given the way it's described, about the age of 80. Pseudo-Athanasius tells us that the sufferings of Job were transferred to Syncletica, and that for 3.5 years she struggled nobly with her illness, and finally died. And the Pseudo-Athanasius says she died amidst visions of angels, holy maidens, radiant light, and paradisial realms. What a good way to go. The account of her life was written not long after her death, but largely ignored or untranslated until more or less 100 or 150 years ago. And I've already told you a little bit about the Desert Fathers. But because they were recorded at all, and because she was distinct as a woman leader in this monastic movement, she becomes associated with the anchorite tradition. So even though there are hundreds and hundreds of desert monks, mostly men, the ones that we remember, Palladius, Evagrius, Antony, Syncletica, Sarah, Theodora. Syncletica is right up there with the big names because of her identity. And so today, what I want to do is we read some of this. I also want us to sort of learn a little bit more about women in this desert movement, and kind of, we're going to have to use some creativity, some historical creativity to kind of imagine what's not being said. So sort of reading between the lines, some of y'all are better at that than I am, and so I'd love to hear your insights as well. Let me pause for a moment before we turn to what was written about her or what she herself said. Questions, comments? I'm going to hand this microphone to Adeline, who thought she was going to get breakfast. She will still get breakfast, but she will walk around the room whenever it's time for questions and bring the microphone to you. Questions or comments about Syncletica or anything we've talked about so far? Any insights into Syncletica? Thank you, John, for that offer. What else? Any questions or comments, Syncletica? I'm really enjoying the series. I hope you have as well. Each week it's just kind of strange, weird stuff, but in anticipation of this class, I spent a lot of time kind of reading and remembering some of the stuff that I've studied in the past. Really fun stuff. Anything else? Well, let's dig in. Syncletica was a practical teacher. That shouldn't surprise us. Let's read a little bit about her as a practical teacher. I wonder if I can get one volunteer to read those 4 short sayings, and you'll see that all of them come from the sayings of the Desert Fathers. They're not necessarily sequential, though I give you them in order. Who might read those 4 little paragraphs for us? Pretty please. Adeline will bring you the microphone. Dave looks like he's willing to read them. Oh, either way, you pick, Adeline. We'll go closer. Thank you. Thank you. Read that for us. Thank
Practical teacher. If you find yourself in a monastery, do not go to another place, for that will harm you a great deal. Just as the bird who abandons the eggs she was sitting on prevents them from hatching. So the monk or the nun grows cold, and their faith dies when they go from one place to another. When you have to fast, do not pretend illness, for those who do not fast often fall into real sickness. If you have begun to act well, do not turn back through constraint of the enemy, for through your endurance the enemy is destroyed. Those who put out to sea at first sail with a favorable wind. Then the sails spread, but later the winds become adverse. Then the ship is tossed by the waves and no longer controlled by the rudder. So when in a little while there is a calm and the tempest dies down, then the ship sails on again. So it is with us. When we are driven by the spirits who are against us, we hold to the cross as our sail, and so we can set a safe course. Sayings 9. It is not good to get angry, but if this should happen, the apostle does not allow you a whole day for this passion, for he says, "Let not the sun go down." Will you wait till all the time is ended? Why hate the man who has grieved you? It is not he who has done the wrong, but the devil. Hate sickness, but not the sick person. Sayings 13. There are many who live in the mountains and behave as if they were in the town.
Thank you.
And they are wasting their time. It is possible to the solitary in one's mind while living in a crowd, and it is possible for one who is solitary to live in the crowd of his own thoughts. Sayings 19.
Thank you. What do you notice? Let me share another image of Syncletica. What do you notice in those 4 sayings? Anything stick out to you? Dave's got something?
So the last one, there are many who live in the mountains behave there as if they were in the town. Whenever we talk about these things, I think about how impractical and sort of, she lives in a tomb, and she doesn't. What does she eat? How does she make her clothes? You must live a completely different way, apparently.
Yeah.
I just can't even imagine what that feels like.
Yeah. Thank you. Sometimes people are surprised to know that we have monastics in the Episcopal tradition. We have Anglican Episcopal monks and nuns. I've spent some time, certainly overseas, of course, but I've spent some time in this country. at a monastery in Augusta, Georgia, the Order of St. Helena. They moved their mother house from New York down to Georgia. They're not large communities, but imagine what it means to kind of give one's life to that. And even they, though, sleep with a roof over their head and usually with air conditioning and have meals together. And cenobitic or communal life is very different than this monastic sort of alone life. So all I can do, Dave, is to kind of get a glimpse that this is a special life, but I don't get it either. Like, what? Why? Yeah, what's the benefit? Dave, do you want to follow up? Yeah.
And the only community that I know about is like Subiaco, right?
Yeah.
Where they have like an economy, and they, run a school and have income and have a practical plan for how to like sustain the thing.
Yeah.
Whereas these people are just like, yeah. I'm going to go sit in the desert and see what happens.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine.
And I can hear Syncletica saying, yeah, those fake religious, right? They've just exchanged one city for another, right? One economy for another, right? Yeah, Jeannie.
One thing that strikes me, I do these 10-day meditation retreats, and the first 4 or 5 days when I'm there, it's totally silent. Nobody's speaking to me. I'm not speaking to anyone else. When I go in, there's a lot of noise in my head. I mean, I'm thinking about, the last encounter I had with so-and-so, and the last class I taught, and the student I'm worried about, and, this, that, and the other. And about 4 or 5 days, all that begins to just go away. Yeah. But what struck me was this line here: "It is possible to be a solitary in one's own mind while living in a crowd, and it is possible for one who is solitary to live in the crowd of his own thoughts." I mean, it's those thoughts that's so hard to it's so difficult to get to the place where you're not obsessed with your own thoughts, and that's what I've found. That really resonates.
Yeah, thank you. I like that too. Jerry, right next door.
I thought I'd point out that although these are pictured as a cave, the cemeteries are actually a family tomb, would be carved in the solid rock. It would be a large room, maybe only 5 feet, 6 feet in height, but maybe 30 feet on each thing. And then the graves would be cut like file drawers into the side of the room, and there'd be a bench around. So it's really not quite like they were called caves by the ancient people, but this is what they actually looked like.
Yeah.
And so, and they were getting food and stuff. An aesthetic like this people would leave the things.
Yes.
So,
a lot of times people would bring stuff to them. Like part of I think of this more in sort of in the farther east, right, where typically Buddhist monks sit along the road, and all they get is what's given to them, right? And part of our faithful, like since I get a paycheck, part of my job is to give money or food or bring that, right, to care for those who have chosen this ascetic life. And so people would bring them stuff, all the time, and that's how news travels, right? I heard there's a woman over there in that family tomb. Maybe she needs some bread today, and then you go and see her, and after a while, you just appreciate sort of her aura, or perhaps the way that she's praying, and then you tell somebody else, and the next thing you know, you've got 40 people gathered around saying, "Syncletica, teach us." Yeah. I love the bit about the eggs. Part of me, I wonder, what can an Amma teach us that an Abba couldn't? What images would come naturally to Syncletica that would never come naturally to me? And I am drawn into this image, which is really practical. If you establish yourself in a place, don't move, right? But she uses the image of just as a bird who abandons her eggs prevents them from hatching, so too a great evil or coldness comes upon those who move from one place to another. Sort of a way of saying put down roots. I love that particular image. She's also known for these ship images. She uses a lot of boat images. In her few sayings, there aren't that many, but she refers a lot to boats. I don't know that she was from a merchant family. Alexandria is certainly a coastal town, so maybe that was just familiar to her, but several times in her saying, she'll talk about what does it mean to be a boat. She likes that kind of image as well. Did anybody hear, and this might come from sort of my past and in some ways my, I don't want to say disdain, but my unease with my past. In the third of those paragraphs, hate sickness but not the sick person. Have you ever heard someone say hate the sin but not the sinner? Have you ever heard that? It's usually what we mean when we say that I'm going to condemn people who are gay for being gay, but I'm going to convince myself that I actually love them. It's not them that I hate, it's their identity that I hate, as if we could somehow speciously separate the two. When I heard that, I bristled a little bit, but I've kind of leaned into it over the last sort of 24 hours or so. I trust that Syncletica has something holy in mind and not the way that it's been used pejoratively in my experience. But I love that kind of image, you know, that it's not talking about sexuality, of course, but it is not the person who's angered you who's done the wrong. It's the devil working in that person. That's her image for that. And so if you're going to be angry at anybody, why would you be angry at that person who's wronged you? Be angry at evil itself. If you want to personify that, be angry at the devil or the demon itself. Why would you hate your sister or brother? I just found that a surprisingly tender but an interesting thing. And I don't know of anybody who connects that phrase with Syncletica, but it sounded familiar to me. Anyway, I saw some nods, so maybe that sounds familiar to you as well. Anyway. Yeah, all the way across the room. Thank you. Here it comes. We use a microphone because there are people who watch online, and even though we might hear you, they certainly will not be able to hear you, and we'd love to all be able to share it. So yes.
So I had a question about do not hate the sinner, but hate the sin, essentially.
Yeah.
So from what I understand, in Christianity, we have this notion of free will. So our choices can sometimes lead to good or wrong. Yeah. But according to what she says, it sounds like we just kind of attribute that action to the devil, but not the person who did the acts. So how should we understand?
Yeah, great.
That?
That's a great question. You know, and so let me approach it from the opposite end, and then come back to the middle, and say that even though she says something like hate the sickness, but not the sick person, she would also say things like. You should fast, you should pray, you should stay awake, you should wrestle with this. Like our piety, our practice matters. And so I don't want to answer the question, what would Syncletica say about the will and the human will? But she and maybe all of the desert leaders and teachers have a really clear personification of evil spirits and the devil. And so I hear in these words a willingness to be angry. You're allowed to be angry. It's okay for you to be angry at somebody, but you've got to the Apostle Paul in Ephesians tells us you got to get past it. Don't let the sun go down in your anger, which is probably good advice. It's in the Bible, though it's not always easy. But I hear Syncletica teaching us it's okay to be angry at a person, but ultimately what's at the very core of that, the deepest part of that, is it's coming from something else. Do we fault that person for how evil is working in them? Maybe, but maybe not fully. And so I think it's gray. I think it's a gray area. I think there's a real tension there, and I don't think it wraps up really neatly. But I think Syncletica knows that demons are at work in the world, and they lead us astray, and sometimes lead us to do really terrible things. And because of that, a life of holiness is important, to be able to resist those things, and yet she kind of wants to have it both ways, which I think is our experience as well, right? You know, if we've ever lived with someone who suffers from addiction is an illness. But that doesn't mean that we find it easy to live with someone who's abusive or dangerous, right? I mean, there are clearly boundaries. So how do we do that? And that's the challenge. How do we love someone and yet can't have a relationship with them, right? And so we see some of that tough tension. Yeah, I feel it. Yeah. All right. Let's move on to the disciple of Thecla. Who would read that next bit for us, please? And the stuff that's italicized are quotations from the Bible, even though the particular quotations are not given in a lot of old Christian texts. When authors move seamlessly from their writing to the words of the Bible, copy editors then put them in italics to just kind of give us a wink and let us know if that sounds familiar. It should. It's in the Bible. Who would read that paragraph, the disciple of Thecla? Jeannie will read it for us. Thank you. This is from the Life, but you will tell very quickly that it's not written or said by Syncletica. It's by her biographer.
disciple of Thecla. One could consider her the true disciple of the blessed Thecla as she followed her in the same teachings. Indeed, Christ was the one suitor of the two women, and for them both, Paul was himself the leader of the bride. I also think that even their bridal chamber was not different, for the church was their single nuptial cell. The same David, too, sang holy and divine canticles over them. For with the fine-sounding cymbals he gladdens the souls dedicated to God, and with the timbrels and the 10-stringed psalteries he sends up his perfect song. And for these holy wedding rites, Miriam leads in the dancers with the words, "Let us sing to the Lord, for he is gloriously triumphant." And to those sharing the delicacies of the divine banquet, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." And a single cloth they had for their wedding robes. All who were baptized into Christ clothed themselves with Christ. They had, therefore, a love of Christ of the same kind, for they were deemed worthy of the same gifts. But even more, they contended with the same struggles. The acts of witness of the blessed Thecla are known to all, how through fire and wild beasts she struggled valiantly. And I do not think that Syncletica's virtuous sufferings and exertions go unnoticed by the crowd. But if one Savior was the object of their longing, then necessarily one enemy was also their adversary. And, I fancy, Thecla's sufferings were milder, for the evil of the enemy was diminished since he attacked her from without. But in Syncletica's case, he demonstrates his more piercing brand of evil by disturbing her from within through her own contrary and destructive thoughts.
Thank you. What do y'all notice in that bit? We don't know enough about Thecla, is what I notice. I want to know more about this Thecla who did battle with evil beasts. What do you notice in this paragraph? It's not Thecla's words, but there's heavy bridal imagery, marriage imagery, which is interesting. Yes. What else do you notice? I love the kind of an anachronistic, sort of the timeless, seamless appropriation of ancient Old Testament figures like David and Miriam into this story, right? You know, into as if it were contemporary, as if David were the one singing psalms above Thecla and Syncletica, right? I love this kind of image, and that gives me some insights into how the ancients thought of biblical figures and saints and holy ones and time. I'm interested in that kind of a presentation. What else? Anything else of interest to you? I think there's a danger that we kind of lean into here that women, because there aren't very many who are remembered, who are written about, who rise to that kind of level of notice among the men who are usually the propagators of this history and this teaching, that we end up kind of pigeonholing women and saying, do you want to be the secretary of our committee? Right, that kind of classic sort of move. So I wonder how much of this bridal imagery and how much of this kind of sort of the nuptial imagery is simply because Syncletica was a woman. I also think it's interesting, and as much as I kind of want to question that, I also want to say how interesting that the tradition very quickly associates Thecla and Syncletica, these two remarkably brave, distinguished saints of God, that they become sort of associate with each other. Syncletica kind of achieves that sort of level of notice, and in particular with her ability to resist the wiles of the enemy. What else? Anything else that you notice? I want to offer as a transition from this reading to the next one, notice at the very end, the author, the biographer, Pseudo-Athanasius, notes that Thecla, whom everybody knows suffered, everybody knows was attacked, but I think her sufferings were less significant because her attacks came from the outside. She was attacked by beasts and demons from the outside, but Syncletica, She had to deal with that internal attack, the attack that came from her own thoughts. There's a real psychological struggle that Athanasius, Pseudo-Athanasius gives us. And I want to turn over to the other side, and I want to hear a little bit more about that internal affliction. And in particular, I want us to notice what, these are now Syncletica's words as they're recorded for us. I want us to notice kind of the language that Syncletica uses to describe internal temptation. And I want you to just think with me about what it would mean for an ancient woman to have taught like this. Who would read for us the bit about internal affliction? Who would read that bit? Dave will read it for us. He was leaning ever so slightly in his seat, so I will choose him to do that. Thank you, Dave.
When, moreover, we do confine ourselves to our houses, not even there should we be careless, but should maintain our vigilance, for it has been written, "Stay awake." The more we secure ourselves in chastity, the more we are plied with galling thoughts. As Scripture says, the one who increases his knowledge increases his sorrow. For the more athletes make progress, the more they are matched with stronger opponents. Consider how much you have advanced, and you will not underestimate the present situation. Were you victorious over actual physical sexual impurity, then the enemy will inflict it upon you through the senses. And when you protect yourself from this too, he continues to lurk in the crannies of the mind, stirring up a battle of the spirit for you. Even for women who live as solitaries, he conjures up handsome faces and old relationships. It is essential, therefore, not to give your assent to these fantasies, for it has been written, "If the spirit of the ruler rises up against you, do not yield your place." Giving your assent to these fantasies, moreover, is equivalent to sexual impurity in the world. Scripture says, "But for those in power, a powerful testing will be imposed." The struggle against the spirit of sexual impurity, therefore, is a major one, since it is the chief among the enemy's evils directed to the destruction of the soul. This is what blessed Job is suggesting when he referred to the devil as the one who has the power in the navel of his belly.
Thank you. What do you make of that? What do you notice? What's of interest to you in that paragraph? Yeah, Jeannie, here's the microphone.
How much it resonates with the opening line of the practical teacher, to stay in place.
Yeah. Yep.
To stay in place and not be bestirred. And I mean, it looked like, I wouldn't have associated this first reference to sort of sexual urgings.
Yeah.
But it's sort of, I mean, whatever the temptation is,
Yeah.
it is bestirring you.
Yeah.
It is
Yes.
moving you from the true path.
Yeah. So let me lean into that a little bit and say, many of these men went out into the wilderness to get away from women, the tempters. And Syncletica is saying, but even if you stay at home by yourself, even if you try to cut yourself off from those women, those seductresses, temptation's right there. I mean, she's writing from a woman's perspective, but even if we stay at home, still temptation comes and finds us in these mental images. I think she's given a wink at the men who would have said, "You don't belong here," right? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I actually kind of like it that she struggles with that too.
Yes.
And because it's associated with men struggling it,
Yes.
and that is associated with the evil of women.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so she's just sort of slicing right past that
Yes.
and talking about her own struggle with it. So we get sight of the fact that it's not just about evil women. It's about those urgings that are natural to all of us as human beings.
In how many Christian communities is the teaching to adolescents, boys resist temptation, girls resist becoming a temptation for the boys? Right? How often is that the case? How often is modesty given to women for men's sake? Right? And yet Syncletica won't have any of that. She talks about how for women, temptation is real, and it's sexual impurity. And even if you can resist the physical bit, it'll come to you in the senses. And even if you can resist the senses, it'll come to you in the crannies of your mind. I love that she gives us the full sexual identity of women, and not just men as sexual beings, and women who are objects of sexuality. Right? I think it's remarkable that this 4th century monastic woman of all people, the monastic, right? The monastic, never married, cut off, that she she gives us that. And surely Syncletica knew that what she was saying is something that many wouldn't have heard in that day, right? Yeah. Yeah, other thoughts, other reflections. Yeah. I think at the end, when she notes, the struggle against the spirit of sexual impurity, therefore, is a major one, since it is the chief among the enemy's evils directed to the destruction of the soul. Like, you know, I was thinking about Happy Meals the other day, and when I was young, everybody got the same toy in their Happy Meal. It didn't matter what gender or age you were, everybody got the same toy. Then they had like age-specific toys, like if you're under 2, you want the ones that don't have the small pieces so you don't choke, but if you're over 2, everybody gets the same. And then they would start asking boy or girl, right, boy or girl. And I remember saying, well, actually, I have a girl who would rather have the Transformer than the Barbie. Like, you know, anyway, like what good is that? I don't know what they ask anymore. It's been a while since I've asked. But, you know, in the teachings of the church, it would be easy to say in the class for the men that sexual temptation is the chief way that the devil gets you. But for women, I don't know what it would be. But the stereotype wouldn't be sexual temptation. Though why not, right? I mean, why not? I love that Syncletica gives us that. And I also love, apart from the sort of the gender correction here, I also really like the way that it's physical, sensual, and then the crannies of the mind, stirring up that battle within you. I love, even for women who live as solitaries, he, that is the devil, conjures up handsome faces and old relationships. That's as contemporary as anything, right? Isn't that great? I love it. Anyway, all right. Who would read for us a very Evagrian text, like drives out like? We might not have time for all of them, but who would read for us like drives out like? Thanks, Adeline. I appreciate it.
Well, what do we need for the present conflict? Obviously, austere asceticism and pure prayer. These, however, provide a general protection against all destructive thought, but it is necessary to employ some particular mental devices to ward off from ourselves the infection of the soul that threatens at the moment, and to counter base thoughts with their opposites as they are attacking. For example, if in the crannies of the mind there should appear a vision of a beautiful apparition, it should be opposed instantly by one's rational faculty. One should mentally gouge out the eyes of the image and tear the flesh from its cheeks and slash off the lips too. Then one should look at the ugly framework of the bare bones. Then one should view with scorn what was the object of desire. For this the mind would have the strength to retreat from a foolish deception. Just as it is appropriate to drive out a nail with a nail, so it is appropriate to drive out a demon.
Thank you. Like drives out like, nail drives out a nail. That's very Evagrian. Evagrius uses that same language. And the idea is that if you're praying and you get a tempting vision, instead of trying to just run away from the vision, add to it. Gouge out the eyes of that tempter or temptress. Rip the flesh off its cheeks. Make that image ghastly. Then you can resist it. I just think it's a beautiful sort of spiritual and very practical teaching. I love her authority. There is authority in this text. This is not someone who's dabbling in psychotherapy. This is someone who speaks with real spiritual authority. She is a leader. She is a commander of her disciples. She's got this advice. She's learned from others. She doesn't quote Evagrius directly. She doesn't say, blessed Evagrius taught us this. She speaks as one who's done this, and she has the authority of that. I think there's remarkable authority in her voice, given how unlikely it is for women to take positions of authority in this particular life. I'm going to read that last paragraph. We're not going to read the one about useful struggle, though it's interesting enough. Let me offer a couple of reflections before we get to it. There's a lot of debate about desert amas. It has become popular, of course, to celebrate the desert fathers and mothers. You almost can't say desert fathers without saying desert mothers, or else people in a setting like ours sort of look at you with ire. There just aren't a lot of desert mothers who are recorded for us. Like in the whole sayings of the desert fathers, which, page and page of text, there are only 3 mothers who are bothered to be reported. So one asks then, is that because, likely, men just didn't bother to write their stuff down? Yes. Is it also because there just weren't a lot of women? Maybe. We don't have a record of them. if we didn't have women, why didn't we have women? Why weren't women invited into this community? So I think there are different hypotheses about why we don't have these texts, and I'm sure there's a little bit of everything to be mixed in. What I appreciate about Syncletica is that she lets us see that, of course, there were women in the desert. Of course, there were women doing this. And that first section that we had where she says, there are plenty of people who live in the mountain who might as well be in the city, and there are those who live the solitary life who are busy with the crowds in their minds. I hear in her a concession that for many women, they're not able to pursue this life. They're not able to get that kind of proximity to God. And yet, that's a call for many who aren't kind of able to fully answer that call. So I hear a lot of her practical teachings aimed at those who aren't able to embrace it fully. Let me read these instructions for women, as I've titled it, from her life. This is what Syncletica taught, particularly to women disciples. Let us women not be misled by the thought that those in the world are without cares. For perhaps in comparison, they struggle more than we do. For towards women, generally, there is great hostility in the world. They bear children with difficulty and risk, and they suffer patiently through nursing, and they share illnesses with their sick children. And these things they endure without having any limit to their travail. For either the children they bear are maimed in body, or, brought up in perversity, they treacherously murder their parents. Since we women know these facts, therefore, let us not be deluded by the enemy that their life is easy and carefree. For in giving birth, women die in labor. And yet in failing to give birth, they waste away under reproaches that they are barren and unfruitful. I love her, a couple things. I love her willingness to acknowledge the challenges that women in society, her society, bear. I love her teaching to the women around her that don't give in to the devil's temptation that the women back home have it easier. That's a hard life too. So part of this is just to say to disciples, don't give up, hang in there. It's not going to be any easier back there, hang in here. I also love the fact that she's got women to teach this to, right? This doesn't get written down. This doesn't get recorded if it's not said to a meaningful audience. So clearly Syncletica is a teacher of women, a master for female disciples. So whether we have record of it or not, we can trust that there are women around her. There are women to receive this teaching, to share this teaching, to propagate this teaching. As I read more and more of Syncletica, I read insights that Abbas weren't able to give, only the Ammas would have been able to give. And so any chance we get to preserve that and celebrate that, I think, is important. Not only because, again, the women's experience in the desert life is different from the men's. They left society to go out into the desert, and then they were turned away from even the desert monks because they embodied temptation. They have to renounce the renouncers, if you will. There is a perhaps an even deeper connection with where God is and how God is moving. So I like Syncletica and the other Theodorus there and other Ammas. You might remember last week the Palladius. Palladius records women's stories too. He actually doesn't record anything from Syncletica, but he records these stories too. And he says, there are women who struggle equally with men and who have equal claim on the prize of their faithfulness. So Palladius thought it was important as well. Syncletica also gives us some of that firsthand account. I've enjoyed our desert fathers and mothers, this desert practice class. I hope you have too. Lots more to be read. Next week, Palm Sunday, we will not have a class in the parish hall. Instead, the children will present a staged reading of the Stations of the Cross. So I invite you next week to be in the church at 10 o'clock for our formation opportunity presented by them. Thank y'all. Good to see you.